Hi. In this tutorial, we're going to go over how to use loops with array lists. So we have three different types of loops. We have our enhanced for loop, we have our traditional for loop, and then we have our while loop. So I've already started here by creating, I have my names array. I've just added some names to it. And then I have my nums array, that was the integer array, and I'm just adding a bunch of random numbers to it. So I've created a for loop that's going to run 30 times, and every time it runs, it's just adding a new number to the list. And they're going to be random, so every time I run it, we're going to get something a little bit different. So now that we have a couple array lists to work with, let's talk about a couple things that you can do with them. So let's say, for example, let's start out with the nums one. Let's say we want to find the average of all of the elements in that array list. So I'm going to go ahead and use a traditional for loop this time. So my for loop is going to go from 0, because the indices start at 0. We're going to go less than my nums dot size. So instead of like an array where we use dot length, we're going to use dot size for this. So anytime we're working with an array list, a big thing to remember when you're doing the traditional for loop is that we're using dot size to indicate how many items are in the list. So I'm probably going to want to start with a variable called av for average. And every time I go through the list, I want to pull an element out and add it onto that average, right? Because I need a sum. So I'm going to say av plus equals my nums. Now the question is, how do I get an element from the array list? So this goes back to your methods. So unlike arrays, we're using the bracket. We have to think about how to use the methods to pull the element out. And there's a method called .get that would get an element out, and we want to get the element at index I, right? So then this for loop will ensure that we're going to get every item out of that list and add it into average. And then when I'm all done, I'm going to say average divided equals, right? Because I need to divide by my nums dot size. And then while we're at it, we're just going to print this just to see if we get something that seems somewhat reasonable. So I used the wrong division. Backslash instead of a front slash there. So when you run this, you can see that it generated a bunch of random numbers, and it's saying that my average is around 49.6, which would pretty much make sense because we're generating random numbers from 0 to 99. So there's just one example of using a traditional for loop to go through an array list. So now let's look at an example of using an enhanced for loop to go through an array list. Now, one important thing we need to remember about enhanced for loops and array lists are that we cannot use them to alter items in the list. So if I wanted to go through my array list and remove all of the even numbers, I can't use an enhanced for loop for that because as I'm doing that, the size of the list is changing, and that's going to kind of mess up the loop. So anytime you're using an enhanced for loop, you want to make sure that it's only when you're really reading elements. So this time we're going to use the names, and we're just going to search for a certain name. So we're going to say for string n in names. So if you recall from the last unit, that's my basic setup for an enhanced for loop, where I have to indicate the type of data that the list has. This is my name for the element, and then this is the list that we're going through. So we're just going to do something real simple here. We're just going to say if n, so now instead of having to use the .get, this loop kind of automatically does that for you. So when I use n, that is the actual element out of the loop. So if I say if n dot equals, let's say we're searching for the name Peggy, we're just going to say system.out.print, and then we're just going to say found it. So now when I run this, we're basically just checking if each element in names, if there are any elements in names that are equal to the name Peggy. And we can see that when we run that, there should be, because Peggy is in my initial list of names, it did say found it. If I put a name in there that's not, like cat, and I run it again, then you're going to see that it's not going to print found it because we didn't find it. Now, if you were doing something with a situation where you had to indicate whether you found it or not, then you would also need to include a Boolean there, I think, is to indicate that I found it. And then if the Boolean's true, then we say found it. Otherwise, we don't. We can't just simply add in an else statement here, as that's not going to, any item that's not equal to it, it's going to print something, and we don't want it to do that. So the other thing I just want to talk about real quick while we're on this one is how do we deal with an array list of objects? So I'm going to go ahead and add some student objects to my array list of students. And if I take a quick glance at the student class, you can see that a student object has a name, an age, and a GPA. So we can do this a couple different ways. The first, I could do it this way. I could create a student object. obj1 equals new student, and then we'll say Mark, 16, and he's got a GPA of 3.6. And then to my students array list, I could say students.add, and then I could just have it add obj1. Another way to do it, I could say students.add, and then I could say right inside of here, I could just say new student. Sam, 15, and got a GPA of 3.8. So when I add student objects to an array list of students, you just need to make sure that you're creating the full student object first, and then you're adding it to the list. And then if I wanted to go through that list and say print the names of the students that are in my list, right now I only have 2 students, but we can use a for loop to do that. I could say for int, there's a couple. We could use a traditional or we could use the enhanced. I'll go ahead and use a traditional again. I is less than students dot size. So again, don't forget, we need to use the array list methods. And then I could say system.out.println. Okay, so this is where it gets a little bit tricky when you're working with objects in array lists. So the first thing I need to do is get the element out of the list itself. So I'm going to say students.get I. Okay, so that got the whole student. And then I only want the name of that student. So this is where I got to go back to my student class and say, do I have a method that just gets the name? And I do right here. Public string get name is just going to return the name. So when you're working with a list of objects, the first thing you have to do is get the entire object out of the list, which we did here with what I have highlighted. And then you have to do whatever method that's needed for whatever the job is that you're doing. So in this case, I'm going to say .get name. And so then that's going to get the student out and then get the name of that student. So that's a little bit tricky with array lists because there's a lot of dots going on there. One dot to pull out of the list, one dot to then call the method that's needed. And you can see that it printed Mark and Sam. So that's just a quick rundown of using lists. You can also use loops. You can also use a while loop. Really works just the same as a while loop would work in general. I could say, for example, I could create a counter, set it equal to 0, and then I could say while C is less than names dot size, right? So that we make sure we go through the whole list, and then I could just say system.out.print names dot get C, because C is my counter. and then don't forget to increment it. So that's really equivalent to going through the whole names list and printing each name in it on its own line and using a while loop instead of a for loop. But to be honest with you, if you are going to be going through array lists, for loops are much more common. So there's your rundown of using loops.